Before we discuss the last two creative zone settings of your camera, let's show you a couple more useful exposure settings for your camera. Even when using one of the basic or creative zone settings of your camera, you may find it useful to change the exposure up or down a bit. By using a plus exposure compensation, the subject will get a bit brighter. By using a minus, it will get a bit darker. To use the exposure compensation feature of your camera, press the shutter button halfway down to activate the displays. Press the exposure compensation button. Rotate the quick control dial left or right with your thumb towards the plus or minus end of the exposure scale. Each unit on the scale represents an exposure stop, doubling or halving the exposure. Now press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. Another tip, reset the exposure compensation to 0 when you're done. Otherwise, it will remain in effect even if you've powered your camera off and back on again. A second useful exposure feature of your camera is the exposure focus lock feature. To use the auto exposure lock feature of your camera, press the shutter button halfway down to activate the displays. Aim the camera so as to center in your viewfinder the portion of the image that you want to be properly exposed. Press the AEFE lock button. Recompose your picture by zooming out or moving the camera one direction or another. Now press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. Release the shutter and wait for the asterisk icon to disappear for the exposure lock to clear. Another tip, keep the shutter depressed partway down in order to keep that exposure setting. This feature will automatically measure just the center 9% of your viewfinder when locking the exposure. Note, if you have selected an autofocus point, the meter will be set to that point rather than the center autofocus point in your viewfinder. The most manual creative zone feature of your camera is the manual mode, indicated by the M on the mode dial. Use this to set both the aperture and shutter speed setting yourself, and let the camera display an exposure scale, which indicates what your final exposure will be. This is very handy when you want complete control over your camera's exposure. To use this setting, set the mode dial to M and press the shutter halfway down. Turn the main dial to select a shutter speed. Turn the quick control dial to change the aperture. Move either the shutter speed or aperture until the exposure scale indicates that you are on 0 or dead center position. Press the shutter and take the picture. A tip, if the exposure scale indicator is on -1 or 2, your exposure is 1 or 2 stops darker than expected proper exposure. If the exposure scale indicator shows a +1 or 2, your exposure is 1 or 2 stops lighter than expected proper exposure. You cannot use either exposure compensation or auto exposure lock when using the manual mode of your camera. The last creative zone mode setting is the auto depth of field priority mode, or ADEP mode. It will evaluate all of the focus points to determine an aperture that will give enough depth of field to keep them all in focus. To select this mode, switch your mode dial to ADEP and point and click. Note, you may need to hold the camera very still. Besides checking your LCD and actually viewing the image after it's taken, another great feature for checking exposure is by viewing the image's histogram graph. A histogram is a graph of all the highlights and shadows of your photo. It represents the range of brightness from shadows on the left to highlights on the right of a horizontal axis. Midtones are shown in the center. On the vertical axis, the magnitude from 0 to 255 of brightness is displayed. The higher the vertical line at any point along the horizontal axis, the greater the number of pixels that the image sensor captured in that range of shadows, midtone, or highlights. A histogram of a photo showing only a lot of pixels in the shadows range on the left side of the graph represents a picture that is mostly dark. And similarly, a histogram of a photo showing only a lot of pixels in the highlights range on the right side of the graph represents a picture that is mostly light. A well-exposed picture is typically one that has a fairly even distribution of pixels across the entire histogram. To see the histogram of an image, press the play button to review photos. Scroll to the photo whose histogram you want to see, press the info button. Press the info button again to return to normal play mode. Press the play button again or the shutter button to return to normal camera mode.